Well, the People's Free Festival wasn't originally at Stonehenge. The early People's Free Festivals were in Windsor Great Park, just outside Windsor Castle. They were the idea of a man called Bill Dwyer. Ubi Dwyer, he was known as. He called himself William Ubique Dwyer, which is the Latin for everywhere. And he came up with this idea of having a really big free festival. It was a time just after the Isle of Wight and the first big commercial music festivals. And he wanted to have a big pop festival, and he wanted it to be free, and he wanted it to be in the Queen's back garden, and he wanted 5 million people to come. And the idea caught on, and for 3 years people got away with the People's Free Festival at Windsor. And then the police put a stop to it.
The police were among the fans before most of them knew it. When the young people wakened up to what was happening to them, most accepted the inevitable and left then. But a large minority resisted, first by forming percussion groups in front of unappreciative lines of policemen.
There have been 1,002 other convictions. As a result, both the Berkshire County Council and the Maidenhead and Windsor Borough Council took the view that they had a duty to take all possible steps to prevent a recurrence of such a deplorable event.
Caused quite a lot of controversy at the time, the actual police raid that finished the thing off, because they came in the middle of the festival at dawn on the 5th day, I think. Some people later sued the police and got damages out of them over that. And the original People's Free Festival was also an August bank holiday, and during the late 70s there were a series of efforts by various people, and Sid Rawle was one of them, to keep it going. And one of the things that did, I think, was to distract the authorities' attention from the fact that at the same time another free festival had established itself at Stonehenge over the summer solstice, and the first one was in 1974. And when the police stopped the August festival, the People's Free Festival tag got tied onto Stonehenge. So these two traditions of the People's Free Festival and the much older Stonehenge tradition of gatherings at the solstice came together and became really well established. The travelling scene in many ways grew out of the festival scene. I mean, there were various things that went into it, but the free festival circuit during the summer was the important part of it, because people found themselves spending the entire summer, in many cases, and by the early 80s, travelling around from one festival to another. There was one every weekend. And if you're going to do that, it makes sense to live in your vehicle, and people started to do that. And the alternative travelling scene really started from there. I mean, there were also contacts with traditional travellers in Romanis and other travellers, and some people from traditional travelling families appeared on the festival scene and passed on some of their background and knowledge of that lifestyle, and lots of people picked up on it and started living that way all year. And by the mid-80s, I mean, as far as the new travellers were concerned, I mean, most of them had only been doing it for a few years. And the Stonehenge Festival had always been there. It had always been part of the travelling scene. It was the one fixed point of the year, because the itinerary varied during the rest of the summer. But during June, particularly the couple of weeks around the solstice, Stonehenge was where everybody would be, and Stonehenge is where you'd meet your friends. And Stonehenge was also where you'd make money, because it attracted large crowds. And people selling food and oddments could make enough money at Stonehenge to keep them going for most of the summer. And it grew up naturally from year to year. It was helped a lot, I think, by the fact that the man who actually farmed the land was a man called James Wirt and his son Andrew Wirt. were very practical people, and I think the people who were running the Wiltshire Police at the time, at least locally, were fairly practical people as well. And they all rapidly came to the conclusion that they had to live with this and manage it. And it worked out quite well. It got a little bit odd sometimes because they always had to be in a position to say, as they always did say publicly, that this was illegal and unauthorised. The two words appear in every description of the festival that you ever see in the media. The myth had to be maintained that these people were trespassers. In fact, it would be arranged in advance on what field and through which gate and on what day people would go. In most years it was like that. Some years people turned up early. But the details were always worked out by negotiation, and the feeling among the authorities and certainly the police was, well, yes, in principle this is something we would like to put a stop to, but everybody knows you can't do that. And that was the position. That's what policing used to be like before the big change in the 80s. There were situations which policemen were quite used to coming across, where you may have a view that something might not be happening, but if there's no actual violence going on, a large enough group of people doing what they want to do, you let alone, because it's not worth the hassle to interfere with it, and that's the way they looked at it. And things changed at Stonehenge when things changed in society generally, and when the view of the government and the view of policing changed.
Night and day, in rain, in snow or sunshine, the policemen are out on their beats, friendly and helpful, being firm where firmness is called for, and being kind to those who seek aid. The policeman is a friend of the people, and he knows that they will always turn to him without fear or restraint in their time of need.
This first or specialist weapons will be used. This is your third and final warning. Gunners ready! Gunners engage!
And we came to a situation where the police had to be in charge always, all the time, of everything. And people who didn't do what the police wanted them to do had to be made to do it. And whatever resources it took to do that would be forthcoming. And it was in 1985 that we saw the result of that new policy, which really came as a great shock to everybody involved, including, I think, most of the members of the Wiltshire Police.
Could you briefly describe the process that the English Heritage National Trust went to in order to stop the festival for 1985?
Well, it started actually in 1984. The National Trust, whether or not encouraged by the police, I suppose we'll never know, I think decided in 1984 that stopping it might be a good idea. And there was a real prospect of them doing that right up to the middle of May, when they actually announced that the festival would be allowed to go ahead that year. And I think that was the point where the decision was made to stop it in 85. And I think what happened at the festival in 1984, it's really the only way of making sense of it, was that the police were giving people rope. They were accumulating a dossier of things that they could use against the travellers and the festival in future years. And it was actually in September that the National Trust first announced that the festival would not take place in future years. I remember they wrote to Festival Welfare Services, and I had to deal with the letter, and I don't think we took it terribly seriously. We thought, well, is this just the National Trust being silly? And nothing more happened until December, and then they launched this enormous publicity campaign. Or they thought it was an enormous publicity campaign. I mean, it seemed a large publicity campaign if you were interested in the Stonehenge issue, but I'm sure most people in the country never saw any result of it at all. They produced thousands of leaflets saying the Stonehenge Festival is not going to happen. They put ads in magazines and the music press and around the place. English Heritage had a couple of press conferences. The police had a press conference, so that wasn't until May. I think they realised, well, they knew that their main problem was with the travellers, because the travellers would arrive first. The travellers always arrived first at the festival. And I think they also realised that their publicity wasn't actually going to reach the travellers, because by and large, they don't read Melody Maker and NME, as it would have been then. And it was again just a matter of preparing the groundwork and getting things on record that could be used later, because they'd had their legal advice, and the legal advice had been you have to warn them. So they put a lot of emphasis on this all the way through. But it was still not clear in April and May 85 what was likely to happen, because the National Trust particularly, not the police, but certainly the National Trust, were also very keen to be seen to be talking. And I remember setting up a number of meetings. I mean, the last of them was only 5 days, I think, before the 1st of June, at which various people connected with the festival talked to people connected with the National Trust, and there was another proposal put to them after that they were still supposed to be considering. And nobody really knew what was going to happen until a festival that happened at Long Marston. I mean, it was one of these typical festivals that sort of happen. It had in fact been planned as a charity fundraising event and advertised, and people were going. This was the last weekend in May, quite close to Stratford-on-Avon. And then at the last minute, they cancelled. And of course people turned up anyway, so what we ended up with was basically a traveller gathering and a small festival. Most of the people there are people who would have been going to Stonehenge anyway, and it just happened coincidentally that at that point a lot of them were together. So that was the origin of the 85 convoy. And as it went south, on May the 31st, it grew because other groups came in from other directions. And there's always been a lot of confusion about exactly where people thought they were going. I mean, we've heard from a lot of people who were on that convoy, and I've talked to a lot of people on other occasions, and virtually everybody had no idea where they were supposed to be going, except it wasn't Stonehenge. There was going to be a site somewhere, and where they ended up on the 31st was Savernake Forest, and whether that was accidental or whether somebody had thought of it in advance, I don't really know. I mean, it may simply be that somebody was driving past and thought, that looks like a possibility, and drove in there, and the next one to drive past thought, there's a bus in there, let's go and see, and then that's where everybody ended up. Because it is the main roads, the main road south to the Salisbury Stonehenge area from the Midlands. So they all ended up in Savernake Forest. Having met the police on the way, and Wiltshire police again were concentrated on this warning thing, they stopped people and they went through this performance with this piece of paper, whereby they asked people 3 rather complicated rhetorical questions and were supposed to write down the answers. The purpose of this being to accumulate, to put it on record that people had been told that they couldn't go to Stonehenge. And most people, I think, found that process extremely confusing. I mean, what they were basically wanting to know when the police did this to them is, are you stopping us here? Are you saying we can't go on down this road? And when it eventually emerged that no, the police weren't saying that, I mean, people weren't particularly concerned about what the police were saying might happen if they went to Stonehenge. Because you have to bear in mind that by that time a long record had built up of the police telling people things about events being off and the likes of that. And people had got used to the fact that the police tell you lies, and they wouldn't have taken what was said to them very seriously. I don't think most of them did. So they ended up in Savernake Forest, having gone through this process, still not really knowing what was likely to happen. And I think more people turned up at Savernake than anybody there really expected. And they suddenly thought, we've got an awful lot of people here. We've got 400 or 500 people. Tomorrow's the 1st of June, and some people had always advocated the 1st of June for the start of the festival, so let's go. Nobody knew that the police had planned a completely unprecedented type of operation against them. Nothing like this had ever happened anywhere, so of course they weren't expecting that.
We are prepared for any contingency which may arise, and although I've told you how many men I've got available, I've also got maximum cooperation of my neighbouring chief constables that they're prepared to assist me if I require that aid.
The original injunction, which came from the High Court, gives a distance. It mentions 4.5 miles as the closest people could come to the stones on the road before the injunction applied. So those people who had who had seen the injunction, I mean, not many had, but those who had possibly had 4.5 miles in their minds. And of course, where they were stopped was more than 8 miles from the stones. I mean, how far the police plan had been worked out in advance, I don't suppose we'll ever know. But I mean, the way the police saw it wasn't that they were going to divert this thing. It was that they were going to put a stop to it. And what putting a stop to it meant was never articulated, and I don't suppose it was ever written down either. But I think there was an understanding about it among those who carried out the operation. And at that point, they didn't have that many police on the spot. I mean, we don't know how many, but possibly 300 or 400. When people avoided the roadblock by turning left and then turning right, which was the obvious way to get round it if you were heading in the direction of Stonehenge, what they ended up doing, unknown to themselves, was heading straight for the police operations centre, where their radio communications were, where the headquarters car was, where the firearms unit was, right for the middle of the whole thing. And they had to stop them, and at that point I think there must have been a little bit of panic, and they had to improvise by detaching units from the back of the roadblock and sending them round by way of the roundabout to block the road in front of the convoy. At about the same time as the police were smashing windows, convoy vehicles went into the field. And the police at first tried to stop them doing that, but realised, I think, quite soon that this was really in their interests. If they got people in this field, they could block them off, they could stop them getting out, and they could stabilise the situation for several hours while they brought up the reinforcements. And by 7 o'clock, having contained people for 4 hours, they had available in the area, the figure they've given is rather more than 1,300 police officers from 6 forces. There was a special unit from the Ministry of Defence Police that policed Greenham. There were units from Thames Valley Police who managed to be on the spot whenever anything particularly unpleasant was happening. There were, in fact, only a small minority by the end were actually Wiltshire police. I think it was 83 out of about 600 that went into the field, 600 or 700. So they were faced really with this improvised operation, which involved hundreds and hundreds of men who'd just been trucked in from all over the south of England. And because you couldn't see the field from the road, they knew nothing until they stepped through the gap in the hedge onto the field. They knew nothing about what they were going to face, other than what they'd been told, both what they'd been told officially in the way of briefings, and what they'd been told unofficially by way of gossip going on while they spent 4 very hot and uncomfortable hours sitting in the riot vans waiting for something to happen. And the state some of those officers were in was really one of total paranoia and total unreason. I mean, all the descriptions of what happened, I think, make it quite clear that those police, as they went into the field, let alone anything of what happened later, were not people in a normal, reasonable state of mind by any account. And they started, as far as one can tell, some obviously behaved themselves, but the incidents of violence and police malpractice of various kinds started right away before the people in the field had an opportunity to do anything about it. What this trial is about is claims for false imprisonment, assault and damage to property, and the main issues are, were the police entitled to make the arrests that they did make on the 1st of June 1985, particularly the arrests of these 26 plaintiffs? If they were, did they use unlawful force in making those arrests? And did they commit acts of unlawful damage to people's vehicles and property, both at the time of the arrests and later?
In the police's case of the Beanfield trial, would you say there was any inconsistencies with their evidence?
Inconsistencies were to a penny. I mean, there were more than 100 police witnesses, and wherever more than one policeman saw the same event, the descriptions were completely different. And to some extent you expect that. And the things which surprised me were not so much the inconsistencies as the omissions and how critical some of them turned out to be. For instance, on the police video, which turned out to be quite important, there is a piece missing. Nobody knows how large a piece. Estimates vary from a few seconds to more than a minute, where the tape, we're told, accidentally broke. But that is at the crucial point where the convoy is stopped. In the police radio log, which we were provided with, there are breaks. There are breaks of a couple of minutes where the tape was changed.
At the moment, the jury are considering their verdicts on allegations of strip searches. They'll then consider claims for damage to property and wrongful imprisonment. Kate Roberts, Coast to Coast, Winchester Crown Court. Great. Can you just send me one shot of the court? Just to help me.
Now, I just read my arresting officer who arrested me. I've just seen his statement of how and what he says happened and where I came from, and it is complete and utter lies. Everything I'm being told in the court is lies and prejudice for their side. They're just going to try and get out of it as best as they can, it's obvious.
And the thing which really struck me is the officer in charge of the pound gave evidence as to the kind of documentation there was on the vehicles that they took into custody and the state of those vehicles and the contents of the vehicles. And there was a file for each vehicle and everything went in there, details of property, particularly high value property, details of damage, details of everybody who visited that vehicle and what they took away with a photograph of them. Where is all this information? It's no longer available. It's gone. The whole lot is gone, apart from the photographs of each person with their vehicle that they kept for intelligence purposes. I mean, if we'd seen the evidence that the police had managed to lose over the last 5 years, I think we'd probably know a lot more about things than we do.